Okay, so today we are going to find out what happens in chapter 3 of Mr. Majeika. Are you ready? And chapter 3 is called Hamish Goes Swimming. In fact, for a long time after that, Mr. Magic, as all class 3 were soon calling him, didn't forget that he was meant to be a teacher and not a wizard. Nothing peculiar happened for weeks and weeks, and the lessons went on just as they would with any other teacher. The magic carpet, the chips and the snakes seemed like a dream. Then Hamish Bigmore came to stay at Thomas and Pete's house. This wasn't at all a good thing, at least not for Thomas and Pete, but they had no choice. Hamish Bigmore's mother and father had to go away for a few days, and Thomas and Pete's mum had offered to look after Hamish until they came back. She never asked Thomas and Pete what they thought about the idea until it was too late. Hamish Bigmore behaved even worse than they had expected. He found all their favourite books and games, which they had tried to hide from him, and spoilt them or left them lying about the house where they had got trodden on and broken. He pulled the stuffing out of Wim's favourite teddy bear, bounced up and down so hard on the garden climbing frame that it bent, and talked for hours and hours after the light had been put out. So Thomas and Pete couldn't get to sleep. "Oh, it's awful," said Thomas. "I wish that something really nasty would happen to him." And it did. Hamish Bigmore was behaving just as badly at school. The business of the ruler turning into a snake had frightened him for a few days, but no longer than that, and now he was up to his old tricks again, doing anything rather than listening to Mr. Majeika and behave properly. The Wednesday morning, before Hamish Bigmore's mother and father were due to come home, Mr. Majeika was giving class 3 a nature study lesson with the tadpoles in the glass tank that sat by the desk. Hamish Bigmore was being ruder than ever. "Does anybody know how long tadpoles take to turn into frogs?" Mr. Majeika asked class 3. "Haven't the slightest idea," said Hamish Bigmore. "But please," said Melanie, holding up her hand. I don't think it's very long, only a few weeks." "You should know," sneered Hamish Bigmore. "You just look like a tadpole yourself." Melanie began to cry. "Be quiet, Hamish," said Mr. Majeika. "Melanie is quite right. It all happens very quickly. The tadpoles grow arms and legs, and very soon." "I shouldn't think they'll grow at all if they see you staring in at them through the glass," said Hamish to Mr. Majeika. "Your face would frighten them to death." "Hamish Bigmore, I've had enough of you," said Mr. Majeika. "Will you stop behaving like this?" "No, I won't," said Hamish. Mr. Majeika pointed his finger, and Hamish Bigmore vanished. There was complete silence in class 3. They stared at the empty space where Hamish had been sitting. Then Pandora Green pointed at the glass tank and began to shout, "Look, look! A frog, a frog! One of the tadpoles has turned into a frog." Mr. Majeika looked closely at the tank, then he put his head in his hands and seemed very upset. "No, Pandora," he said. "It isn't one of the tadpoles, it's Hamish." For a moment, class 3 were struck dumb. Then everyone burst out laughing. "Hooray, hooray, Hamish Bigmore has been turned into a frog. Good old Mr. Magic." "It looks like Hamish, doesn't it?" Pete said to Thomas. Certainly the frog's expression looked very much like Hamish's face, and it was splashing noisily around the tank and carrying on in the silly sort of way that Hamish did. Mr. Majeika looked very worried. Oh dear, he kept saying. "Didn't you mean to do it?" asked Jodie. Mr. Majeika shook his head. "Certainly not. I quite forgot myself. It was a complete mistake." "Oh," said Thomas. "Can you not just turn him back again?" Mr. Majeika shook his head. "I'm not at all sure that I can," he said. Thomas and Pete looked at him in astonishment. "You see," he went on, "it was an old spell, something I learnt years and years ago and thought I'd forgotten. I don't know what were the exact words I used. And as I'm sure you understand, it's not possible to undo a spell unless you know exactly what the words were. So Hamish Bigmore may have to stay a frog forever," said Pete. "That's the best thing I've heard in ages." Mr. Majeika shook his head. "For you maybe, but not for him. I'll have to try and do something." And he began to mutter a whole series of strange sounding words under his breath. All kinds of things began to happen. The room went dark and the floor seemed to rock. Green smoke came out of the empty jar on Mr. Majeika's desk. He tried some more words, and this time there was a small thunderstorm in the sky outside. But nothing happened to the frog. Oh dear, sighed Mr. Majeika. What am I going to do? Okay, have a little think about what Mr. Majeika is going to do. Pop it on Cecil so I can have a look, and we'll find out the answers, possibly in chapter 4 tomorrow. Okay, we'll see you then.